Something just happened in the Middle East that the mainstream press is barely touching, and what you're not being told matters more than what you are. Iran claims it struck and destroyed a $1.5 billion U.S. missile radar system inside Qatar. Now, before you dismiss this as Iranian propaganda, stop. Because whether the strike was fully successful or not, what this moment reveals about the architecture of American power in the Persian Gulf is extraordinary. The United States has spent decades building a fortress of military infrastructure across the region, billions of dollars, layered systems, bases, alliances, all designed to project the image of invincibility, and that image is the weapon. The moment that image cracks, the entire strategic logic behind it begins to unravel. This isn't just about one radar installation, this is about whether American deterrence in the Middle East still means what Washington says it means, and whether the countries in that region are starting to draw very different conclusions. Let's think about this carefully, because the geography alone tells you something important. Qatar. This is not some remote, forgotten corner of the world. Qatar is home to Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, thousands of U.S. troops, sophisticated aircraft command and control infrastructure, and yes, advanced missile defense radar systems worth billions of dollars. This is supposed to be the crown jewel of American military presence in the Gulf. It is the nerve center from which the United States coordinates air operations across multiple theaters. And Iran is now claiming it reached inside that fortress and destroyed a $1.5 billion radar system. If even half of that claim holds up under scrutiny, you are looking at one of the most significant military events of the past decade. Not because of the hardware, because of what it signals about who can do what to whom and where. Now let's talk about how Washington responded, because the response itself is revealing. The initial reaction from U.S. officials was measured, carefully worded. The kind of language that bureaucracies produce when they are trying to manage a narrative rather than confront a reality. There was no thundering declaration of retaliation. There was no press conference with generals pointing to maps. What there was a quiet, almost embarrassed acknowledgement that something had occurred, followed by a rapid pivot toward de-escalation language. And if you've been watching how American foreign policy works for any length of time, you know that this kind of measured, careful, almost subdued response after a major military provocation is not a sign of strength. It is a sign that the people in charge understand something about the situation that they are not prepared to share with the public. Because if you are genuinely confident in your position, you speak loudly. When you speak quietly, it means you are recalculating. And here is where the deeper story begins, because this strike, if it is confirmed, did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a broader strategic context that has been building for years. Iran has been developing what military analysts call an asymmetric warfare doctrine. This is not the doctrine of a country that expects to win a conventional war against the United States military. Iran knows it cannot outspend, out-equip, or out-technology the Pentagon in a straight fight. What Iran has done instead is invest heavily in precision ballistic missiles, drone technology, and the kind of layered strike capability that can reach targets that were previously considered untouchable. And the word untouchable is critical here, because that is the foundation of American deterrence in the region. The entire system rests on the belief, held by allies and adversaries alike, that certain American assets simply cannot be reached. The moment that belief is shaken, everything built on top of it starts to wobble. Think about what Qatar means to the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait. These are countries that have built their security architecture around the American guarantee. They host American bases, they buy American weapons, they coordinate their intelligence with American agencies, and they do all of this because they believe that the United States can protect them. That belief is transactional, it is not sentimental. These are pragmatic governments that make cold calculations about where their security comes from. And when Iran, a country they regard as their primary regional threat, demonstrates that it can strike inside a major American installation without triggering a devastating response, those governments start doing what pragmatic governments do. They start quietly exploring their options. They start making phone calls to people they weren't making phone calls to before. They start wondering whether the guarantee they've been paying for is actually worth what they thought it was worth. This is how geopolitical shifts happen, not with dramatic announcements, not with formal treaties being torn up in public. They happen in the quiet reassessment of risk that takes place behind closed doors in capital cities around the world. And right now, behind closed doors in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Doha, very serious people are having very serious conversations about what this strike means for their long-term calculations. And some of those conversations are almost certainly involving China and Russia, because both of those powers have been actively courting Gulf states for years, offering alternative security frameworks, alternative economic relationships, and an alternative vision of regional order that doesn't depend on Washington remaining the indispensable guarantor it has claimed to be for decades. Let's zoom out even further, because we need to understand the financial dimension of this, and most people covering this story are completely ignoring it. The United States has spent staggering sums of money building and maintaining its military presence in the Gulf. The radar system that Iran claims to have destroyed reportedly cost $1.5 billion. That is one system, one installation, and the broader network of American military infrastructure in the region, the bases, the prepositioned equipment, the naval assets, the logistics chains, represents an investment of hundreds of billions of dollars accumulated over decades. All of it was built on an assumption that American technology, American sophistication, and American military reach would remain so overwhelming that no adversary would dare challenge it directly. That assumption is now being tested in real time, and the cost of that test is not just the hardware. The cost is the credibility that the hardware was supposed to purchase, because here is something that gets lost in the technical discussions about radar systems and missile trajectories. Military power is ultimately a psychological phenomenon. The reason deterrence works, when it works, is not because of the weapons themselves. It is because adversaries believe those weapons will be used effectively and decisively in response to aggression. The moment adversaries stop believing that, the deterrence collapses. And deterrence, once it begins to collapse, does not collapse slowly and gradually. It collapses in cascades. One country tests the limits. If the response is weak or absent, another country takes note, then another. And suddenly, you find yourself in a world where the rules that everyone assumed were fixed turn out to be negotiable after all. We are at the beginning of exactly that kind of cascade, and most Americans are not being given the tools to understand it. Let's talk about Iran specifically for a moment, because I think the American media has done a genuinely terrible job of helping people understand what Iran actually is and what it actually wants. Iran is not a rogue state driven by irrational religious fanaticism. That caricature is politically convenient for certain interests, but it is analytically useless. Iran is a civilization with thousands of years of history, a functioning state apparatus, a sophisticated political class that thinks carefully about strategy and long-term interests, and a military and intelligence establishment that has been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation for decades. The Iranian leadership watched what happened to Saddam Hussein after Iraq gave up its weapons programs. They watched what happened to Muammar Gaddafi after Libya normalized relations with the West. They drew conclusions from those experiences, rational, strategic conclusions, about what it takes to preserve state sovereignty in a world where American power feels unconstrained, and then they built accordingly. The ballistic missile program that Iran has developed over the past 20 years is not a vanity project. It is a carefully designed strategic instrument intended to create exactly the kind of uncertainty that we are now seeing play out. The Iranians have invested in systems specifically designed to overwhelm missile defense architectures. They have invested in precision guidance because precision matters when you are trying to destroy high-value targets and demonstrate capability without triggering all-out war. And they have built redundancy into everything, because they understand that the capability you can only use once is not really a capability at all. What Iran has demonstrated, if this strike is confirmed, is that it possesses a genuine operational strike capability that can reach inside what were previously considered protected American positions. That is a strategic fact, and strategic facts do not disappear because they are inconvenient. Now I want to address something that will inevitably come up in the comments and the discussions around this story. People will ask, is Iran telling the truth? Is this claim accurate? And that is a completely fair question. Iran has incentives to exaggerate. Every military in the world uses information as a weapon, and claiming a spectacular strike against a $1.5 billion American radar system is exactly the kind of claim that serves Iranian domestic and regional messaging objectives regardless of its accuracy. So yes, you should maintain healthy skepticism about the specific details, but here's the thing. The skepticism needs to run in both directions. The United States military also has powerful incentives to minimize, deny, or obscure evidence of successful strikes against its assets. We have seen this pattern before. The attack on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq in January 2020, when Iran fired ballistic missiles directly at an American military installation, was initially described by U.S. officials as causing no casualties. It later emerged that over 100 American service members had suffered traumatic brain injuries. The initial minimization was not an accident, it was a deliberate narrative management strategy. So when American officials are vague or evasive about what happened in Qatar, that vagueness is itself information. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: something happened. Iran conducted some form of strike operation. The United States' response has been notably restrained, and the broader strategic environment in the Middle East has shifted in ways that are going to take months and years to fully manifest. The question worth asking is not whether Iran is lying or telling the truth about the specific dollar value of the radar system it claims to have hit. The question worth asking is what this moment tells us about the trajectory of American power in the region, and about where things are heading from here. Because here is where I want to spend the remaining time. Because this is the part that I think matters most for people trying to understand the world they are living in. We are in the middle of a profound global transition that is happening faster than most people realize. The unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when American military and economic dominance was so overwhelming that it structured the behavior of virtually every country on Earth, is ending. This is not a radical or controversial claim. It is increasingly acknowledged by serious analysts across the political spectrum, including many who are deeply committed to American power and wish it were not true. The question is not whether this transition is happening. The question is how it happens, whether it happens through managed, negotiated adjustment, or whether it happens through a series of escalating crises that each chip away at the credibility and reach of American power until the architecture finally gives way. The strike in Qatar, if confirmed, is one of those chipping away moments. It is not the end of American military dominance in the Middle East. The United States still has overwhelming conventional military superiority in the region. But superiority on paper and effective deterrence in practice are not the same thing, and the gap between those two things is growing. Iran has demonstrated, or at least credibly claimed to have demonstrated, that it can reach inside American defensive perimeters and strike high-value assets without triggering a devastating military response. That demonstration, whether partially true or fully true, changes calculations across the region. It changes how Gulf states think about their security relationships. It changes how Iran thinks about the costs and benefits of future operations. And it changes how China and Russia think about the durability of the American position in the Middle East as they continue to build out their alternative frameworks for regional order. There is also something worth saying about the moral dimension of all of this, because I think American audiences deserve to think about it honestly. The United States has maintained its military presence in the Gulf for decades through a combination of force, financial incentives, and political relationships with governments that are not exactly paragons of democratic virtue. The alliance with Saudi Arabia alone involves a level of moral compromise that most Americans would find deeply uncomfortable if they thought about it carefully. These are not partnerships built on shared values. They are partnerships built on oil, arms sales, and the mutual convenience of keeping certain power structures in place. And Iran, whatever its many real flaws, and has a genuine historical grievance against the United States rooted in the 1953 CIA-backed coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstalled the Shah. These are not alternative narratives. These are documented historical facts. And they matter for understanding why Iran does what it does and why it sees American military presence in the Gulf the way it sees it. Not as a stabilizing force, but as an occupying architecture designed to constrain Iranian power and influence in its own region. None of this means that everything Iran does is justified. It is possible to acknowledge historical grievances and Iranian strategic logic, while also recognizing that Iran's government has its own record of repression, proxy warfare, and regional destabilization that deserves honest criticism. But understanding the full picture, rather than the simplified version that American media typically offers, is essential if you want to make sense of what is actually happening and why it matters. Because if you only understand one side of the ledger, you will always be surprised by events that were actually quite predictable if you had been paying attention to all of the relevant factors. What comes next is genuinely uncertain, and I want to be honest about that uncertainty rather than pretend to a confidence I do not have. The United States could respond with significantly more force than it has shown so far, either through direct military action against Iranian territory or through intensified support for Iranian adversaries in the region. That escalatory path carries obvious risks of a wider regional war. Alternatively, the current restrained posture could harden into a new, uneasy equilibrium, one in which Iran has effectively established a new red line, demonstrating that it can strike American assets and absorb the consequences without triggering all-out war. That equilibrium, if it holds, fundamentally changes the regional power balance over time. There is also the possibility, maybe the most interesting possibility, that this moment accelerates diplomatic engagement, that both sides decide privately that the cost of continued escalation are too high, and that some kind of negotiated arrangement is preferable to a war that neither side can fully control. History is full of moments where conflict pushed adversaries toward negotiations that looked impossible until they suddenly became inevitable. What I am confident about is this: the world that exists on the other side of this period, whenever we get there, is going to look meaningfully different from the world that existed before. The architecture of American dominance in the Middle East is being stress-tested in real time. The alliances, the deterrence frameworks, the assumption of American invincibility, all of it is under pressure in ways that were not true 5 or 10 years ago. And understanding that pressure, understanding its sources and its dynamics and its likely trajectory, is not just an academic exercise. It is essential for making sense of the world you are living in and the decisions, political, economic, personal, that flow from that understanding. Pay attention. This is not a story that is going to resolve itself quietly.